Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm just going to see, we've still got a couple of people filtering in, so I'm going to give it one more minute and we'll go ahead and get going. Actually, I think it's slowing down now. All right, so thank you everyone to coming to this online workshop on getting started with secondary data analysis. My name is Maureen Haker, and I have worked at the UK Data Service for over 10 years on everything from ingesting some of our collections to reuse projects. I specialize in qualitative data, and I'm here with my quantitative counterpart. Ali, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Ali Bloom. I'm based at the University of Manchester in the training team. My specialty is working with survey data, quantitative data, helping people discover it and use it.
Okay, so this is a quick overview of what we're planning on talking about today. So first, I'm going to explain what secondary data is, what the pros and cons are of using it, how the research process differs when you're reusing data, and then the types of projects that you can do with that method. From there, we'll go through a couple different examples of qualitative and quantitative projects that have reused data. And hopefully you'll be full of ideas and we can move into, finding data and what a range of project considerations are, including things like access and documentation and what to consider with the data itself, any sampling considerations, and how to cite the data. We'll end with a bit of signposting to other resources, and we'll check in on that Q&A. There are a couple of interactive activities throughout the workshop to try and keep you engaged and give you an opportunity to explore some of our resources. Um, Before we launch too quickly, we did want to ask here if anyone has reused existing data before. Ali, did you have a Menti slide for this one? I've taken away your slide control without thinking about this one. So we just wanted to see who has reused data before. So if you go back to Menti or if you still have it open, it should be the same code. It'll just change over the question. But you can rejoin by going to menti.com and putting in the same code. So just to see who has reused data before. The workshop, I should say, does assume that you've had some methods training, but it's introductory to secondary analysis. So it's not a problem if you haven't reused data before. We just like to see what some of the experiences of the audience first. Okay, so a lot of you have reused existing data before. Some of you haven't. Excellent. All right, so hopefully we can kind of talk through some of the considerations and check in on how you guys are getting on with some of your projects. Okay, so first we're going to go through what is secondary data. So secondary data is simply data that's being reused by someone other than the original principal investigator, and this is often for another purpose. So we do this on a large scale with our population surveys. So those are usually collected, curated, and published by someone else, often ONS, or us at the UK Data Service. But we do also have other examples, like, for example, Understanding Society is a really popular, well-known survey. And this is basically the people listed under this data collector are the people who collect and analyze the data for a planned purpose. But then we also have a secondary user. And some of you might recognize that picture there. That's Hans Rosling there with his interactive charts. He's got these wonderfully inspirational TED Talks if anyone's interested in some of his work. But the secondary user then reuses that data, but for a different purpose. So this might be to explore a new variable or a new research question or to kind of give it a new spin or a new context. We have had data sharing policies in place in the UK since the 1990s. So this kind of tradition of reusing the data is embedded across research funders and government policies. So for example, UKRI and all of its constituent research councils, such as the ESRC, all have data policies which mandate data sharing for any data collected with its funds. The government within the UK has policy frameworks as well around data sharing for a public good. So that principle that data should be able to be accessed by public bodies is kind of embedded within its policies, where you'll see wording that kind of says data should be open as possible and as closed as necessary. So allowing access to that data for purposes other than the planned context. So within the UK, secondary analysis has this longer history. I did just want to note as well, if you are joining from further afield, it's worth saying that there is a growing expectation elsewhere across Europe and North America around data sharing. So some countries have not formalized this in the same way the UK has within its policies. Some countries have. It kind of depends on where you're sitting. But yeah, this kind of mandate of data sharing is something that's been in existence for some time. So, what are the benefits and challenges to reusing data? Well, the obvious benefits is that it's cost effective, it's time effective, and it reduces the burden on the public to continually answer research questions on the same sorts of topics. So, for the reuser, it also means that there's less ethical issues to deal with because all of that has already been handled by the data collection. And you can extend the discussion about the claims that are made by the data. So there's a transparency there to research where data is opened up to researchers again. But most importantly, secondary analysis often allows you to access data subjects which you might not be able to get otherwise. So, for example, at UK Data Service, we have data sets with, for example, interviews that have been conducted with Winston Churchill's administration. We have data sets with people living in refugee camps or who are serving long-term sentences. One data set, which is deposited by Jane Seymour, interviews families and professionals caring for individuals who are on long-term sedation as part of their palliative care. We also have data sets of research conducted with children and people with disabilities. And all of these are good examples of participants that are very difficult to access without gatekeepers and adequate resources. So secondary analysis also makes it possible to explore some of these data subjects. Secondary analysis can also make the possible, what was impossible possible. So, for example, you can't do historical comparatives without also reusing data that has been collected in previous decades. So we have data reaching as far back as, the early 20th century. You can't go back in time to collect data. So secondary analysis is the only way to do that kind of work. Some places that you might want to go to as well to research people there may be inaccessible. And again, there may be existing data that allows you to explore those places. But it's not without its challenges. So one of the key academic debates surrounding secondary analysis is the validity in which you can claim to know something about data when you haven't collected it yourself. So some academics like Mothner and Perry have made these really compelling arguments that data collectors take quote unquote kind of head notes, or they collect tacit knowledge about their participants and about the research process. And sometimes this is done while being aware they're doing this, and sometimes this is this, kind of subconscious process. But secondary users cannot access that information, making their understanding of the data incomplete. Many others have refuted this claim, but the point stands that it does take a good amount of effort to get to know the data. So you may not need time, to collect the data, but then you do need time to get to know the data. Ethical issues are also much less significant, but that doesn't mean you don't have any ethical issues to tackle. And this is particularly important if you're wanting to access potentially disclosive data. So data where you might have, for example, something like a postcode, a variable in there that starts to narrow your sample group. So there still are some ethical considerations. They're just very different, but we will talk about a couple of those. One of the biggest challenges as well, I think, is finding the right data. So the perfect data may not exist. So you may need to adapt your research plans once you see what data exists on your topic. And when you do find an interesting data set, it's important to note that you can't extend that study. So you can't normally go back to the participants to ask follow-up questions. You just have to work with what's already there. Okay, so of those pros and cons, I think there's two key takeaway points from this. One is that it takes time and effort to get to know the data on your topic and the data that you'll be reusing. And two, you may need to make some pragmatic decisions about what kind of data you will use and what kinds of questions it can answer. We do have some very good high quality data sets, but it's unlikely that you're going to find someone who collected the data exactly as you would have. So you need to be able to work through that when you're doing secondary analysis. So the research process for secondary analysis looks a little bit different from that of primary researchers. So here you can see you have a research question or perhaps a research topic, and then you immediately go to locate the data. You go get the data. So obviously this research process means that you don't have to collect the data, but you do have to locate it and then evaluate that data. See if it meets your needs, and then you can work on analyzing it. And we often think of this kind of process as a very linear sort of process where you can just move from one step to the other quite easily. But of course, as with all types of research, it's often a lot messier than this. So the reality, however, is that this is quite an iterative and cyclical process. You might locate the data, but then you have to go back and amend your research question before moving on to evaluate the data. Or you might evaluate the data, realize that it's not fit for your purpose, so you have to go back and locate more data, and so on and so forth. So it's important to be open-minded, start with this kind of broader search of data, and see, what's out there, kind of what is the scope of what's been collected on this topic already. And then from there, continuously kind of find data, evaluate it, and analyze it as part of that process. And while you might be exploring data, perhaps without a specific question in mind and more of like a specific area or topic you want to explore, you may want to think nonetheless about what kind of research design your project will follow. So there's 4 types of reuse projects that I think lend themselves really well to secondary analysis. So the first of these is reanalysis. We also have a replication study, a comparative study, and a re-study. So reanalysis is probably the one that comes to mind when thinking about what secondary analysis is. This involves thinking about the wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. And it usually means asking some kind of different research question from what the original researchers were trying to do. So, for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. Now, the original illness narratives had been looked at exclusively for health research. So the interviews were meant to explore how diagnoses are made. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were much more interested in an analysis of the discussions between patients and doctors rather than actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that kind of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the original research, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat was looking at gerontology as a topic. She ended up finding a couple of different data sets looking specifically at that topic. But her research was on racism, which wasn't the focus of the original work, but the data set was rich enough for her to allow to explore racism within this area of medicine, within that existing data. Now, if you want to use the same exact analysis strategy, this is a replication study, and that's also possible. So right now, there's a real concern about reproducibility of research, and replication studies can help reveal some of the messiness that's involved in working through data. So one of the most famous examples of replication is from Thomas Herndon, who is a postgraduate student at University of Massachusetts. and he was assigned an assessment to replicate the results from a published study. It's a rather common kind of assessment when you're taking statistics as a student. So he chose Reinhardt and Rogoff's 2010 paper, Growth in the Time of Debt. And basically, this paper came up with the proportion at which your national debt can be of your GDP before you start to see negative economic growth. So Thomas Herndon pulled the OECD data mentioned in the paper to rerun that analysis as the paper had laid out. But he got a completely different answer. So the paper published said that debt cannot exceed 90% of the GDP. However, he calculated that the debt can actually exceed the GDP. And even then, it only has a kind of minimal negative impact on the GDP. So he went to his tutors who were not able to figure out why the answers were different, and they said you're going to have to contact the original investigators. So he did that, and they ended up sending him their original data file, and he found a flaw in their data set where they had miscopied some cells. So they downloaded the files from the OECD, copied them over to a working data file, but they miscopied about 7 countries. So the full story of this is published in 2013 in the New Yorker. A replication study, hopefully, won't always find these sort of flaws in the original study, but nonetheless, it's a study design that's worth considering. You might even develop a project whereby you rerun a series of studies on the same topic, or you explore, I don't know, a complicated data set with missing data, transforming variables, and so on. You can also do comparative work. So you might be looking at an international comparison between 2 countries or comparing social subgroups of the population that are based on a kind of shared social characteristic. We do have some key data pages for quantitative data sets, which outline some of our large national surveys that are held at the archive, and any of those would allow you to do some comparative work without having to go out and collect 2 sets of data. So you can compare samples across time, across geographic place, across gender or ethnicity. These characteristics are usually collected as standard for those larger surveys. The final type of reuse, I'm going to exemplify with a case study, and I'll go through that in just a second. But just to say, this final type is a restudy, and this is where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. So it does a bit of secondary analysis, but it also allows you some scope to collect a little bit of your own data. So the example of this kind of reuse project is from the collection called School Leavers Study. So I am going to talk about a couple of qualitative examples here of reuse projects, and then I'm going to hand over to Ali, who's going to go through a couple of quantitative examples. So the original study for this was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. And as part of that project, Paul found out about a group of teachers who set a particular essay at one of the comprehensive schools just before students were due to leave school. And the essay prompted them to imagine they were reaching the end of their life, and something made them think back to the time that they left school. And they were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. In 2009, Graham Crow and Dawn Lyon, and this is Graham Crow on the left pictured with Ray Paul, decided to reanalyze that data set, focusing solely on student aspirations. So using the very same methodology, they conducted a restudy of school leavers on the Isle of Sheppey in the academic year 2009-2010. So the prompt that was supplied to students in the data collection was nearly the same. So imagine that you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed those essays and compared the themes of the new set of essays to the set of essays that was collected by Ray Paul. And you can see the wording of the prompt there and a small snippet of one of the essays. And the findings are fascinating. And they show the difference of young people's aspirations after one generation. So 40 years of time has passed. But how exactly were they different? Um, so both set of essays kind of covered the same set of themes. So they covered health, education, career, and family and leisure. But they covered them in very different ways. You can see a little bit of a breakdown more on here. So in 1978, there was a little bit of a gender imbalance, which they evened out in the newer data collection, but around the same kind of number of essays were collected. So I'd say they covered the same things, but how did they cover them differently? Well, in 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and it followed on from hard work. And sometimes there were talks of periods of unemployment or being on the dole, or quite morbidly, they also talked about death. So the early death of either themselves or someone they loved. And you can see a few examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one on the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. 2010, however, showed students imagining well-paid and instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also with some uncertainty. Crow and his research team also noted a clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So, for example, you have the quote on the bottom of a girl who writes, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous." So this study is part of a much larger community study. So the goal was to engage the community alongside the research and find innovative ways of including the participants in the research outputs. So as part of that initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which was meant to help create a shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey meant for that community. So this kind of project is a good example of how you might combine a bit of data collection and a bit of data reuse into one project. The next example of project reuse is from a study called Affluent Worker, which was conducted by David Lockwood and John Goldthorpe in 1968. So this research investigated whether post-war economic prosperity had transformed British working class life and attitudes. So they conducted interviews with manual workers at Vauxhall Motors in Luton, and also with workers at Cambridge. And the researchers they had this kind of structured survey with a semi-structured question in the middle around class. And the idea was to test their embourgeoisie-ment thesis. So the idea that affluence was turning manual workers middle class in outlook. So those surveys and the semi-structured interviews with workers and their spouses collected information on income, consumption, aspirations, political attitudes, occupational identity. And they found that while living standards and home ownership had improved, workers' core class identities and their kind of collectivist orientations largely persisted. Goldthorpe continued on after this study to develop the Goldthorpe schema, which form the conceptual basis today for the class categories that are used by ONS in surveys like the census. So on the right there, you'll see that there are 3 seminal publications that arose from this study. And over the years, this particular data set has been used extensively. So it originally came to us on paper-based surveys with handwritten transcriptions of that semi-structured interview because this was the 1960s. So they didn't have other forms of kind of like born digital data files. So different groups have worked to digitize different elements of the study, partly to make it more accessible and also just as part of their research, they would digitize it. And that starts with Mike Savage, for example. So some of you might remember a few years ago, there was the Great British Class Calculator that appeared on the BBC. And Mike Savage was part of that team working with the BBC to explore class in Britain today. But Mike Savage's work on class started long before, including a restudy of affluent worker. So he explored 227 of the interviews that were done in Luton, but he focused on the language that was used by respondents to describe class. So he noted that working class identities, for example, were grounded in being ordinary and authentic. And his work raised how we, as researchers, sometimes impose our worldview on participants when we are guided by frameworks that are built without the voices of those we are studying. And he was better able to explore and explain working class identities from that bit of research. A couple decades later, a historian, Selena Todd, reused the data set as well to explore gender dynamics. So, reusing the same interviews as Mike Savage, she treated the data not as sociological data, but as historical narratives. So, she explored how narratives interwove class and gender expectations and made the argument that affluence reinforced these dimensions of identity. This, to some extent, even refuted Lockwood and Goldthorpe's key finding around embourgeoisement. And it also demonstrated how a different perspective, so her perspective as a historian, can help widen some of the critical discussions surrounding data. And finally, one last example is from another historian, John Lawrence, who also reused affluent worker. So he widened the interviews that he used. So both Mike Savage and Selena Todd limited their analysis to participants located in Luton. Lawrence included all areas that were covered by the original work, including those Cambridge interviews. And rather than focusing on identity, as the previous reusers had, John Lawrence explored the data as historical evidence of social relationships and moral discourses. So this was more of a macro look at the data. His work showed that collectively, classes developed moral frameworks and ways of relating to each other. So class, for Lawrence's work, was shown to be a collective emotional and ethical experience, not just an individual identity that you would hold. So his reading of the data showed that these experiences led to a value system and a structured class feeling, which was more powerful than just individual kind of material aspirations that one might have. Okay, we are going to cover some quantitative examples as well for those of you who are more interested in quantitative data sets. So I'm going to hand over to Ali to explore some of those.
Thanks, Maureen. So yeah, as Maureen said, I'm going to cover some quantitative examples that you can use to for secondary analysis. And the first thing that I want to say is that the type of data that you'll be interested in for quantitative analysis will depend on the type of analysis you want to do. So depend on your research question and what you're interested in looking at. So for example, if you were interested in looking at a snapshot of attitudes or opinions or where people are at in their lives at a particular time point, you'd want to use a cross-sectional survey because this would show you like I say, a snapshot of what happened at that time. So maybe we'd use that around the time of an election to see where opinions were on certain things. If you wanted to see the opinions of a population, so for example, like a country over time, you would use a repeated cross-sectional. So we might survey people in 2010 to see their opinions on Brexit. We might survey them now their opinions have changed. So you might see that sort of thing. If you wanted to follow the same people over time, so for example, say we were interested in the impact of poverty on people in their later life, you would use a longitudinal study that allows you to follow people throughout their whole lives. So someone would be interviewed when they were 18, maybe they would have particular things going on in their life at that time, insecure work or different job opportunities, maybe health conditions. And then you could see how that affected them in their later life by following their answers through the longitudinal data. If you are interested in particular small geographic areas, the census data is really useful for that, because you can create some really lovely maps or visualizations of differences between different areas. And if you wanted to compare countries over time, you'd want to use international time series data. So you can see how particular things like death rate, birth rate, the involvement of women in politics, levels of poverty and education has varied throughout time as well. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of some useful quantitative studies and examples of how they've been used by researchers. So the first example I have is the Crime Survey for England and Wales. It used to be known as the British Crime Survey, and this is an example of one of those repeated cross-sectional surveys. So it's repeated every year, and it's known as a really important source of information about crime because the statistics it produces are independent from police records. So it asks people who have been a victim of crime in the previous 12 months about their experiences, their demographic background, and how they feel about the police and criminal justice system. And that information exists separately to the crime record. So it can be really interesting if you're evaluating people's opinions on the police force, or what they will may reveal in a survey that they may not reveal or may not be recorded in official records. It surveys 35,000 individuals aged 16 plus, and it has a youth questionnaire of people aged 10 to 15 as well. And this is an example, just a little glimpse of what the data looks like. So it's stored as individual anonymized records within a data set. So if you open it up, you'll see that every line here is a different individual. So the first line is someone whose sex is female, and they're in the 20 years old age gap, and they're in work. So that's an example of how you can see that information presented once you download it. And this was some research that was done by Hein Khalife et al. In 2013. And they wanted to examine violence against people with disabilities in England and Wales. So they used the Crime Survey for England and Wales, although then it was, like I say, called the British Crime Survey. And it had recently had disability measures introduced into the study. They used what's called a special license version of the data. We will cover this later. It just means because certain questions might be more sensitive, that data just requires a little bit more agreement from researchers in how they're going to use it, how they're going to protect the data. There might be requirements that you can't use it for commercial use, etc. So they just use this special version of the data. This survey had 46,398 adults aged 16 plus in this version of the survey, and they found that 9,037 of those had at least one limiting disability. And that's how disability tends to be defined in government definitions. So they said, okay, we've got this sample of people, let's see their experience of crime. And they found that when they adjusted for age, sex, and socioeconomic characteristics, so when they took into account other things that could be affecting these experiences, things like the fact that older people tend to have higher disability rates, or the fact that poverty, disabled people are more likely to be in poverty, etc. They took all that into account and found that even with all of those things adjusted for, disability did still increase the risk of experiencing violence. That victimization was highest among those with mental health problems, and that there were 116,000 victims of violence that was attributable to disability. So using this study that had already been collected, they were able to say, look, there's a real problem here. Maybe we need to look at some policy. Maybe we need to explore these experiences. Another example I want to look at is a longitudinal study. This is Understanding Society. It's one of our most well-used studies. It's also known as the United Kingdom Household Longitudinal Study, or UKHLS. It's done annually, and the same individuals are re-interviewed in successive waves, so every year. And actually, this survey is really interesting. If you are interviewing a household and one member of that household moves out, so say a child moves out into their own household, the survey will actually follow that child as well. So you really have that experience throughout people's whole lives. 40,000 households are interviewed, 100,000 individual interviews, and there is a youth questionnaire like the crime survey as well, a specific youth questionnaire of 11 to 15-year-olds. Covers a really wide range of topics: housing, deprivation, ethnicity and language use, health, disability, politics, and new questions are added in at different times as well to reflect the needs of the researchers. And it has also been linked to administrative and biomarker data. So this is held at a much more secure level because obviously it's people's research, people's health information. So the base survey is available if you agree to the end user license, which Maureen will explain later. But there's a few a bit more secure data held that matches to biomarkers, so we can see things like stress levels linked to particular life events and things like that. So there's some really interesting uses for this data. And one use, Booker et al. Looks at the effect of screen-based media on well-being in adolescents, teenagers. They used the data from the first wave of Understanding Society, and they particularly used the youth questionnaire. And they wanted to look at screen-based media, was what they call it. And they wanted to see how did young people use the internet. So that was chatting on social websites, console games, computer games, and watching the television. And they also looked at how they participated in sports. And then they used 2 different measures of their well-being. And they found that overall, there was a 19% decrease in the odds of happiness for every unit increase in use of screen-based media. So those who chatted on social websites or played computer console games for 4 or more hours were at least twice as likely to have emotional difficulties than those who spent less than an hour a day doing this. Interestingly, watching TV did not show the same association, and they found that sports participation led to better well-being, but then also more sport meant that the individuals did less time using social media and screen-based media. And I highlight this example because this was conducted about 10 years ago now. And I think this is a great example of something that would be really interesting to redo in the age of smartphones. If there is a survey, I'm not entirely sure if Understanding Society still has similar questions, but if it does, I think this would be a really interesting example to redo and sort of compare, like the study that Maureen highlighted with the aspirations, how are the screen times changed now? So that's a bit of an idea of all of a lot of the data that's available from us. So Maureen's covered the qualitative and I've covered the quantitative. And now I'm going to give you a little bit of information on how you can find data from the UK Data Service. So just a quick intro slide about who we are. We are a comprehensive resource funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. What that means is that all of the data producers that create these surveys, the Office for National Statistics, the Department for Work and Pensions, independent researchers, etc., they produce that data, provide it to us, we catalogue it, and then we make it available to researchers such as yourselves for use for data reuse. And we also provide support, training and guidance, which I'm sure you're familiar with as you're one of our events today. So the main place to find data from the UK Data Service is our catalogue search. We've recently updated our catalogue, so even if you've used it before, this is a sort of a new interface that we've got. So this is the Find Data catalogue homepage. You can search for data using the catalogue bar at the top. You can also browse for the most popular and useful data under particular themes that might be useful if you're looking for research on a particular topic. And then we also have other discovery tools. So if you were interested in, for example, the census data I was talking about, there are particular census tools. Qualibank is down there, which is a great resource for exploring qualitative data as well. So we're now going to have a go at finding data because it's all very well me sort of highlighting the catalogue search, but I think it's a great chance to get to grips with finding the data yourselves. So I'm going to pop a link in the chat. I will also share it on my screen as well for those who, just in case anyone can't open this link. But what the task is to go to the catalogue search and have a go at seeing if you can find data on either a topic that you're interested in, or if you can't think of one or you haven't got a project that you're thinking about at the minute, have a go at exploring it on one of those topics we've suggested there. And then when you finish that, try having a go with the browsing facets, figuring out how the data search works. So I'm just going to try and zoom this in so it's a little bigger on the screen. We're going to have about 5-10 minutes for this, and then we're going to come back and see what data sets you found. And if you have any questions throughout this process, do feel free to pop them in the Q&A.
I think Ali's gonna go through in just a little bit what the data catalog looks like. But those of you who are looking at it now, you'll see that there's different tabs along the top. So we have our in-house curated kind of tab, as well as our reshare studies. Both of those are pulling up data sets. So it's worth clicking on the different tabs. So if there's nothing coming up through the in-house curation, that's only a part of the archive. It's worth clicking into the reshare to see what other examples, and that's our self-deposit system. So those are ones that are not curated by us, but we have done some kind of quality assurance checking on them. So it's worth looking at both areas to see what kind of studies are coming up.
Yeah, so as Maureen said, feel free to carry on searching. I'll just do a little bit of a highlight of the catalogue now before anyone moves on to the second part, give you an idea of the different ways you can search. So yeah, this is the reshare tab like Maureen was talking about. This is data from individual research or individual projects. And quite often if there aren't any answers, if there aren't any relevant data sets under studies, there may be one under reshare studies like Maureen says. You can also search for particular variables. So it might be that it's not always clear from the dataset title what's contained within it. And if you use the variable tab search, you'll also be able to search for data sets that contain the variables you're interested in. And then, as we said, in the second part, there are all these facets down the left-hand side that you can use to search that might help you refine your search by different topics. And this might be useful if you're not quite sure how to word the topic that you're interested in. All of these relate to data sets that are within the catalogue. I know with social sciences, sometimes we word things in lots of different ways, and this might help you sort of narrow your thinking to refine your search as well a little bit too. So we'll have a couple more minutes. Everyone can have a go exploring the different search filters, and then we'll come back and do a quick Menti question on which data sets you found, and then Maureen's going to give a bit more information on searching for qualitative data. Okay, so no rush, but feel free if you've finished exploring, no worries if you're still exploring a little. Just interested in which data sets did you find that you thought might be useful, or which data sets did you find that met up with the topics that we suggested. So if you want to go back to Menti and just pop that in the little box, that would be great, and then we'll see sort of what kinds of data are available. So yes, some very interesting data sets there. The Millennium Cohort Study is another one of those longitudinal studies. So that took children that were born between 2000 and 2002 and followed them over their life course. And these are linked to, this is some of the linked data I was talking about. It's linked to hospital episode statistics. So looking at how people end up in hospital at different times in their life. And there's some really interesting research done with the Millennium Cohort Study looking at the impact of pollution in younger children and how that affects health over time as well. So really interesting stuff that can be done with this longitudinal data, and some really interesting qualitative data as well. That's the Understanding Society. Just to clarify as well, the BHPS is the British Household Panel Study. That was what was sort of before Understanding Society, and then it's been harmonised so that all the data can also be used alongside the Understanding Society data as well. So if you see the BHPS there, they can be used together. I'll just give one more minute. So if you've got any data sets you've found that's interesting, feel free to pop that in, and then I'll hand back to Maureen to demo some qualitative examples for you. The general election survey, very interesting. Yeah, participation in political organisations. So So yeah, I think we hold about 9,200 data sets, 9,300. So if you're not finding what you want straight away, do have an explore using the different facets, etc. See if you can narrow down to what might be useful. Okay, so I'm going to hand over back to Maureen now, who's going to explore finding the qualitative data.
Yeah. Okay, so bear with me. Let me put this back into our presentation mode. I did see that some of you had found some studies on politics and political opinions. If you're interested in qualitative, we also hold the Qualitative Election Study of Britain, which is a longitudinal study that's been running since 2005. And they run focus groups and one-to-one interviews with people about their voting preferences. Anyways, um, okay, so finding qualitative data. We also have a unique way to search for qualitative material specifically, which is QualiBank. And this is an online resource that allows you to search, browse, and cite qualitative materials. So you can get to it by clicking on QualiBank, which is kind of shown as an option when you're in the data catalog, or you can just do a /QualiBank at the end of UK Data Service kind of URL to get to it. So QualiBank, we came up with this platform to address some of the issues that arise when you're reusing qualitative and mixed methods data. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about those issues as we go along. But in short, those three issues are actually finding the data. It's a little bit of a challenge with qualitative material, recontextualizing the data, and citing the data. So if you want to search using QualiBank, it works the same way as our data catalog. So you have this tempting little search bar. You type in what you're interested in. So here you can see I've typed in typhoid. So I tried this in our data catalog, and I got a few results there. But what's different about what QualiBank searches is that it's actually searching through the data itself. It's not searching through the catalog page only. So if you're looking for qualitative data that has a specific keyword or concept in it, you can use QualiBank to search through the data itself. And this is a key issue when you're reusing qualitative data. How do you know whether or not something is the right data for your project? How do you know you're not missing anything? And the nature of qualitative data is that it's very rich and it's in-depth and it's detailed. And a lot of the interviews or focus groups, whatever the kind of data type is, could potentially answer a lot of different research questions beyond than what just the original investigators chose. So it's a little bit of a challenge to find the right kind of data. What you can also do with QualiBank is that it will search across the different collections and bring them all up. So here you can see that very first search results there is from the Morale and Home Intelligence reports. The second one is from a collection called Pioneers of Social Research. So you can kind of mix and match to where you feel that you can mix and match. So you have to do some work, kind of thinking about the context of those interviews, whether or not they're comparable. But it may also be possible to kind of mix and match to create a data set if you like. You can also change the search. You can see on the left side, there's also search facets, but those are done by participant rather than by study. So if you're interested in females aged, 26 to 25 to 34, who are from a working class kind of background, you can kind of search based on that. So from there, from the search results on typhoid, I kind of scrolled down a little bit and clicked on this one from Mrs. Omison, which is from our collection called The Edwardians. And you can see when you click on your search results, it'll come up with your interview transcript laid out on the web page, and your search term is going to be highlighted within that transcript. What's also nice about QualiBank is that it links to external resources where those are available. So if you click on that link, it's going to take you to the bottom of the page after the transcript finishes, and you'll see there's a variety of resources that are related to that particular interview, including for this particular one, there's an audio extract. Do I have a slide of it? You can just see it at the bottom there, a slightly different one. There's an audio extract. There's an abstract from a book on the Edwardians, and there's some images related to the collection. So it's a really useful tool to help you recontextualize that qualitative data as well. And with that added context, whether it's accompanying audio or expanded discussion on the data from the original investigators or something else entirely, that will help you kind of understand the limitations and opportunities within that data. And again, QualiBank gives you that kind of direct access to those additional resources. Finally, there's also the ability to cite cite by using QualiBank. So we know how important it is to cite your work properly, and that's no different when you're reusing data. So QualiBank automatically generates citations that you can copy and paste into your work, but it does it for the data itself. So it does it by paragraph level. So you can see on the left-hand side here, there's this kind of create citation button. You would click on that, and then using your cursor, you can highlight the portion of text that you want to cite. That create citation button turns into a retrieve citation button. And when you click on that, it will bring up a pop-up box that looks like this. And that contains a persistent identifier. So that's the URL at the end of the citation. And if you click on that URL, it will bring you to this specific highlighted section of the transcript. So this addresses the third issue in reusing qualitative data, which is all about evidencing your conclusions. You don't just cite the general collection or transcript, you can actually get a much finer grain reference so others can see the quotation in the full context of the interview or data set. And that, I think, really helps to add weight to your conclusions and demonstrate transparency to your processes and your analysis. So at the moment, it's worth pointing out that QualiBank is a expanding resource. So we've started it. It's got about, I think it's got about 50 collections in it. We have to actually ingest the entire data set, the entire collection into QualiBank in order to make it available. So this is something that we're kind of going to be doing as a process in the future with more collections, but right now there's about 50 qualitative collections within it. So you can kind of explore the tool, and then hopefully, as time passes, you'll see that it's an expanding database. Okay, so we're going to change discussion here a little bit and talk about some of the project and ethical considerations. And we're going to start with data access. So now you know how to find data, but what about accessing it? So we have very different levels of access, and that includes open access, safeguarded access, and controlled access. So open data means that the data can simply be downloaded from the data catalog without any registration. So this would only be applied to data that definitely has no kind of personal data or no concerns about disclosure. There's no residual risk of any kind of disclosure. So for data where there has had to be some kind of treatment to the data to reduce the risk of disclosure, so this is what the ICO would class as kind of being effectively anonymous, that would be licensed under our safeguarded options, which requires reusers to sign our end user license. And the end user license is a legal document which stipulates, among other things, that any re-identification would require the user to maintain the confidentiality of that identity. It's highly unlikely you would be able to re-identify a participant within the data sets. They've all been treated and checked, but it's kind of this added protection where there may be a concern where there has had to be some kind of anonymization done. Finally, we also offer a controlled option, and this is for any data which is considered sensitive or personal data. So access to that kind of data is only supplied through our what's called our 5 safes framework, and that would require you to access the data in a secure environment. And after you use the data, all of your outputs would have to be reviewed. You also need to undertake specialized training in order to access the data, etc. So the control kind of adds another layer of protection. And what we mean by potentially disclosive is anybody who's interested in a variable that will limit the number of possible people that could be. So things like postcodes, for example, those would all be accessed through our controlled data. Okay, so that is the accessing data is kind of more of an ethical considerations, but we do have some methodological considerations as well, including how you get into the data. So once you've sorted out your access, you then need to make sure that you are making sense of your data. So this is really thinking about the different levels of which you can understand the data. So you might have the project level, where you think about what information was collected, when and where. You might need to think about the participant level. So this is who are the participants that were involved in this research. And you might also have to think about the data file level. So this is any changes that might have happened to the data when it's archived, any treatments on the data as you are looking at it. So what happened to those files? So when you're first downloading a data set and you are trying to understand the data and what you can do with it, it's really important to think about these different levels. And you can do that through the documentation that's made available with the data. So all of our data sets are going to include some kind of documentation with it. So if it's a qualitative data set, you're going to find a user guide and a data listing associated with that collection. If it's a quantitative, you may find a user guide. You should find something like a data dictionary as well alongside it. And this kind of documentation contains all kinds of things. So you'll have, questionnaires, blank questionnaires, interview schedules. You might have notes to the interviewers. I've seen things like draft work, so prior to a publication, some of the draft work that's included. I've seen funding applications. There's one collection in particular, Annette Lawson's study on adultery from the 1980s, where her sample became a little bit of a focus for her because there was a lot of critique of her sample. And she included a 56-page defense of her sample. And none of it made it into any of her publications, but it was something that she had written up kind of on the side and then decided to include it in the documentation. I've also seen correspondence either between the research team or with funders and sometimes with participants as well. I've seen research meeting minutes. I've also seen like pamphlets and that sort of thing that they might collect from the place that they are doing their data collection. So there's a huge range of things that can get included in the documentation, and all of it seeks to add context to those different levels, whether it's the project level, participant level, or the data level itself. Okay, so we're going to do an activity now with documentation. I'm going to pass back to Ali, and you will need to, well, you're going to have a little bit of explore of the documentation, and then you'll need to go back to Menti. I think there's some questions on the documentation.
Thanks, Maureen. So yeah, we're going to have a go at exploring some of the catalogue pages that contain the initial information on the data set. So that's what you'll see if you go into those search results like we found in the previous activity. You click on those, it'll take you to a catalogue page. So for the first task is to explore one of those pages for the Understanding Society COVID-19 teaching data set. There are 3 questions there, so jot those down or keep them in your mind, and then we'll feed back on those in the Mentimeter poll after. And then the second one is to have a go at exploring a mixed methods study. The direct links are in the worksheet that I've linked in the chat. And if you have any questions throughout about the catalogue pages or the data sets, etc., do let us know as well. We'll have about 5-6 minutes on this. Okay, so don't worry if you haven't finished. If everyone can make their way back to Mentimeter now, join. We're going to quickly go through some of the questions for feedback on that activity. So the first question is, what was the observation unit for the survey? So for the COVID-19 Understanding Society teaching data set, was it individuals, households, families, or both? So I'll just give a minute for everyone to feedback their responses. And the Mentimeter code is in the chat for anyone that needs a reminder, just in case it's not large enough on the screen. Okay, so we've got most people answered now. So yeah, the correct answer was both. And you can find this in the coverage and methodology section of the catalogue page if you scroll down. So this is a really good way to get a quick snapshot of whether the data is relevant for your research. So whether it covers the country or the observation units or the time period that you're interested in. So what country does this data cover? You may have spotted it on the last slide if you were observant. So yeah, I think everyone spotted that. So it does cover the United Kingdom. Again, that's in that coverage and methodology section. And what topic examples did you find from opening up the documentation file? What topic examples did you find? Informational working from home, yeah. Great, yeah, socio-demographics, homeschooling, COVID symptoms, social contacts, neighbourhood cohesion. I think we've got most of them covered now. Give one more second in case anyone's typing something. Yeah, socio-demographics and health, volunteering. I think the volunteering variables in this data set are very interesting, so great that they're included there. So yeah, the topics are all of these ones covered here. So background variables, socio-demographic, health and wellbeing, homeschooling, COVID symptoms and tests. So yeah, all of those ones covered there. And that can be found in section 2.1 of that user guide data file. And then just quickly on to part 2, so the mixed methods study. What country do these data cover? So just this one's a type in rather than a multiple choice. So what country do the mixed methods data cover? Here we've got a couple of answers that say England. Yeah, and that is correct. Again, in the coverage and methodology section there. And then finally, what kind of data are these? So are they text data, numerical data, or audio recording? Yeah, everyone who's answered is correct. They are text data. Again, that's in that section under the data format information. So bear with me, I'll just switch back to the slides. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some things you might need to consider once you actually get into that documentation. This is sort of more particular for quantitative data, but there are similar, you will still need to think about similar things with qualitative data, but Maureen's covered the majority of those, I think. So one thing that you'll really need to understand if you're working with quantitative data is who was asked which questions. So these surveys often use something called computer-aided interviewing. Just means that if someone asks a particular question in a certain way, the device that they're using will send them to particular questions. So for example, if they answered the age question as between 11 to 15, in those surveys that have youth questionnaires, it would skip them through the adult questions and send them straight to the youth questionnaire. This means that many questions might only be applicable to some of the sample. So for example, this is a variable on working arrangements. So this, we can see here, this comes from a survey called the Labour Force Survey. We can see at the bottom here, it says applies if in work during the reference week. And then here you've got all of these previous questions that they would have to answer that would define whether they would be categorized as being in work in that reference week. And this is usually what it looks like in the documentation. You might find that it looks slightly different. You might find sometimes there's syntax or code in there to show how this has been defined. But this is a really great way to see how people have been defined and who these questions have been asked to. Something else you might want to think about is after the data was collected, what was done with it? How was it processed? So derived variables are variables that are created from the raw data. This is an example of one of those. It does look complicated at first glance, but once you've had an explore of the documentation, it's much easier to get your head around. So this is a variable that's called flexw7, and it measures whether a respondent works a 0 hours contract or not. And it was derived from this previous question, which we can see that number 7 asked whether individuals worked a 0 hours contract. And all that's been done here is the data has been processed. Those who answered number 7 on the previous question were coded as 1. Everyone else was coded as 2. And the -9, there's the missing data. And therefore, this new variable now measures everyone who works a 0 hours contract. Not all documentation has these lovely flowcharts. Like I say, some would be syntax or just a description of how the variable's been derived. But it's really important to know who your questions were asked to and how that data has been processed. One more thing you need to consider is sampling. So surveys are based on samples, so a selection of the population that should be representative in order to make claims about the wider population. And you need to think about whether the sample that you're using is representative. So who is included in the sample? Some surveys only include those in private addresses, so they won't interview those, or they're not able to access to interview those people in places like care homes or those individuals without a fixed address. You need to think about the response rate and any bias this might cause. So certain individuals might be more likely to respond to the survey than other individuals, and what bias might this introduce? And then you need to think about whether you need to apply a weight. So survey producers are really great. They produce a weight alongside the survey data, and this can be used to overcome a lot of those issues with response rate and bias. They do a lot of clever maths in the background, and then the weighting variable is applied. So you need to make sure you're looking as to whether there's a weighting variable in the documentation that you can apply as well to make sure that your results are representative. And finally, you need to think about sample size. So do you have enough cases to make a precise estimate? So this is really important if you want to study a small subpopulation. So you might be studying, all women in the sample, which is probably a large proportion. But like we saw with Hein Khalifa et al., their study looked at disabled people, which tend to make up a smaller proportion of the population. And when they scaled it down, they had a nice sample of 9,000 individuals. But you may find that if you are selecting individuals with particular characteristics, you might end up with a sample size that's too small to make those claims. So really important to think about that. And finally, Maureen's already mentioned data citation, but some of you may have spotted on the catalogue page that we do have a data citation tool that you can use to just copy and paste the correct citation. It's really important. This lets us know how the data is being used. It's important for reproducibility, and for if anyone wants to do a replication study or anything like that in the future, makes it a lot easier. And the tool allows you to just select whichever format you prefer, so APA, Harvard, etc., and copy and paste that into any of your work. Just going to switch back to Maureen. She's going to talk about some other resources we have to explore as well.
Yeah, so just a final, I know we're winding down to the last few minutes, but just a final point about some of the resources that we have that will help you get started with any kind of secondary analysis projects. So check out our training and our online learning. We have a range of topics related to data management that might be of interest, including those that are listed here. So if you're looking for a specific type of data, we do have training sessions on that. I'll be doing one later in the term on qualitative and mixed method data. If you're looking for data management, so if you're doing your own research, and you just want some, what are some of the best ways of doing, this aspect of research? Do you have recommendations around consent form wording or participant information sheet wording, or do you have information about how to save files or how to anonymize, etc.? Again, we have lots of guidance on data management. And we also have some computational social science. So if you're interested in getting into computational social science or you're looking to expand your skill sets, we also have some training on that as well. If you need direct support on your specific project or any of the processes related to our services, so that includes things like downloading the data, depositing the data, publishing data, you can always get in touch with us. So we have our help desk that you can send in a query to us. And we also have a number of help pages, which will have a lot of very specific information there. If you would like to see more examples of those who have reused data or deposited data, you can check out our impact studies, which detail a lot of those. So these are divided up based on theme, but you can explore basically how our data is being used by research. And finally, we have a laundry list here of resources that we find particularly useful, including things like the Timescapes Methods Guide series. There's a couple of textbooks as well. There's one that's specific to qualitative data, and one that is more specific to quantitative data. We also have video tutorials and then our tools and templates pages. So even if you're not reusing data, some of those resources are going to be helpful. So for example, our tools and templates is where you'll find things like our model consent form, which you can reuse and adapt for your own project. You can also find us on social media, so be sure to sign up for our Jisk mail list. We published, I think it's on a weekly basis, isn't it, Ali? We publish the new releases, so that will include new data sets as well as new editions of data sets, but we kind of compile those into a single newsletter that we send out via our Jisk mail. So if you want to see the data as it's being released, sign up and you can see you'll get email about that. And finally, we've also got a lot more online workshops that are coming up. So the ones that are listed here are kind of the ones that we have on regular rotation. So you'll get those once or twice a term. So if there's anything that you think you might like to attend, please go to our events webpage and you can register for those. We have things on documentation for research data. We have anonymization of research data. We also have sessions that are on, the ethics and legal considerations for reusing data and sharing data. And I think that is it from us. We have, I think, managed to finish just on time. So if you do have any follow-up questions, you can always pop us an email too. Otherwise, we'll just double check the Q&A box. You can send it through the Q&A box now, and we can always answer those live. And I think we've finished just on time. So if you do have anything that comes up, so if you're thinking about some of the material we presented and you have a question, feel free to pop us an email, or you can, if you can't find our email, you can always just go to the help pages and you can send a query. It will make its way to us. It'll get forwarded to us. So feel free to get in touch if you do have any specific questions that comes up later. Okay, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We hope to see you at some of our future events as well. Please don't forget to fill in the evaluation survey. It hopefully will only take you a couple of minutes, but it does really help us when we plan our training events. So we will have a look at the ones that we run regularly and update them based on the feedback that we get. And then if you have any suggestions for things you'd like to see in future, there's space as well on that survey for you to type in anything that you might see. But it really helps us if you are able to take a couple of minutes. The evaluation survey, as soon as you leave the session today, it should automatically pop up. So we really appreciate you taking any time to fill that in.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day and good luck with using secondary data.